Welcome, everyone, to Bulls in a Barn podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Zimmerman, and joining us today is Reese Jones from Jones Family Farm. Reese, thank you for being here. Before we get started and let Reese talk a little bit about his story, where we're going to be talking about food mislabeling and mislabeling in the agriculture market and sector, we like to start our episode, Reese, by asking our guests a question. So the question of the day for you for this podcast episode is name 3 of the most common mislabeled food products consumers purchase. And there's more than just 3, so you can select from a couple of them.
Okay, so
did I throw you a curveball?
Like a little bit. So I went to Virginia Tech and I got 2 degrees, 1 degree in horticulture and the other one in business. And something that I learned in agribusiness is that there was a huge lawsuit that took place in Georgia over a new tax that was put into place in the early 1800s. Ryan might even remember learning this in class. There was a big lawsuit and went to the Supreme Court of Alabama, and it was about whether or not tomatoes are classified as vegetables or fruit. So that's the first thing I want to say is mislabeled, whether plants are vegetables or fruit. Because my horticulture side is tomatoes are fruit because they come from a flower. It's a mature ovary and associated parts. So that's not really much in the public sphere and nobody really cares about that, but I care about it and I think tomatoes are fruit. So that was 1. 2 is definitely milk.
Yep.
Almond milk. Other examples, it's like, soy milk. That's not milk. It's alternatives that are made at huge processing facilities owned by large corporations trying to mimic an agricultural activity, which is dairy farming, milk produced from a cow. And so consumers are confused by that. They think it's milk, but it's not milk. It's from plants. It's very different. Third thing is when it comes to just rhetoric, of course, what we're going to talk about today is farmers markets. I'm going to talk about that later. So that's not one of my 3. I'm not going to talk about this today, but my number 3 is definitely the solar farms. And I do not believe that they should be called solar farms. Putting solar panels on top of farmland, that is not what farms are meant to be for. It's not an agricultural product. Electricity is not an electrical product. If it was, then peach bottom, which produces energy through nuclear fission, should be considered a farm as well. And so until electricity is considered a farm product, we shouldn't be calling solar farms farms. They are electrical generation facilities. So solar facilities, not farms. That's all. That's my pulpit.
I like your answers, but instead of solar farms, can you give me one more food? The tomato one I'm gonna let through because I'm not sure if I think you're correct by saying that, and that's one I didn't have on my list. But give me, if you can think of one more food real quick before we go into it. So I'll give you a hint. I'll throw you a hint of one. Bees produce it. So honey is actually a very common mislabeled food product. Now, specifically I couldn't find specifically what about honey. I don't know if any of you know why honey is considered mislabeled a lot. The other ones were olive oil, saffron, orange juice, coffee, and then also fish. And seafood in general has actually had a lot of mislabeling. But you gave me a curveball by saying solar farms because I did not. You gave me a new perspective on how to answer that question. So that was really good. You gave all of us, I think, a little bit of a curveball on that. So I liked your answer. But the tomato one, I didn't remember that. And when you talked about that court case, I was like, oh yeah, I do remember that, learning about that a little bit in school.
Yeah, because fruit were assessed like a lot more highly than vegetables because they're fruit. They're trying to protect their domestic fruit market. And so where was tomatoes, were they going to be taxed the same, like higher or lower because it's a fruit or not? So it was really neat.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And with that said, Reese, I wanted you to talk a little bit today about what happened with the Sprouts Farmers Market incident with you and your family farm over in Hartford County. You and I have talked about it I was working with Farm Bureau at the time when it happened. I remember what was going on. Remember, there was a big discussion in the legislature about it, but I thought, yeah, that's what happened wasn't fair, and they shouldn't be able to label themselves a grocery store chain as a farmer's market, but they're still allowed to do it, and they're still up and running now anyway. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about that, and we'll chime in. And I want especially Adam and JT and Kathy Lou, who have a little bit of expertise, more JT and Adam, because they run their own family farms as well, and then Kathy Lou talking a little bit about her expertise with working in the seafood industry. But Reese, tell us a little bit about that story.
All right, so Sprouts Farmers Markets is a really large chain grocery store located I'd say in the Midwest. And it was interesting. They popped in there during the pandemic when everybody was crazy about produce. I mean, that was our biggest year, was during COVID, because people didn't want to shop at grocery stores. I'm sure Adam felt the same thing at his place, the Millers. That was the biggest year for us because everybody didn't want to be in the congested environment of grocery stores. So in order to take advantage of that environment, of the market shifting away from centralized, they saw the market being pulverized by people not wanting to shop at contained grocery stores where there's a lot of people.
Yeah.
So people were running out of Walmarts, people were running out of Targets, and we wanted to find other places to go. So Bel Air welcomed Sprouts. They're welcoming a Whole Foods soon. Bel Air has a lot of grocery stores. It's pretty crazy. But so Sprouts moved in where the old Circuit City was, and they labeled themselves as a farmer's market. It's right underneath their name, Sprouts. It says farmer's market. And to many of us, me, my sister, my mom, my dad, customers that we have a lot of customers in Bel Air come down to us. They were very confused because they were like, oh, we'll just go to the farmer's market and we'll support you guys through that way. And I was like, you talking about the Bel Air farmer's market? No, we're talking about Sprouts farmer's market. So it's a very confusing way to label your business as Sprouts as a farmer's market. It's quite misleading, and that's something that we're going to talk about later. So what we ended up doing, it was something my sister and I did. We approached local legislature. I think we talked to Jason Gallion about it. Jason's awesome. And then we
started. Only farmer legislator currently in the Maryland State Senate, by the way. I'll keep that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that later when we actually testify in Annapolis about the bill that Farm Bureau created to protect the labeling of farmers markets. So, and something else we did was we'd go into him. We also did our own research. We started noticing that other states do have labeling laws as well. And how did that get started? And how do you complain? How do you have a voice for yourself when things like this happen to your neighborhood? Because a lot of times when large corporations step in and they're getting their way, we seem to be quite helpless. So we learned that you can actually submit a claim with the state's attorney's office about mislabeling to customers. It is illegal to do that. You can't claim to be something and not actually be what that is. And so we were on the phone back and forth with them, and I think their goal is to be a mediator between the complaining party and the business that's being complained about. And so next thing you know, we're on these conference calls, and big shot Sprouts attorney is on the phone too. And don't get me wrong, like they made some really good points. Like there's no in literature in the state of Maryland, there's no laws that say like define what a farmer's market is. So they're doing everything that they can to conform to the law. I'm sure they have a lot of things that they have to say, but there's nothing wrong with you making a stand for yourself and making a point. There are outlets in which you can use in the state government in order to get your voice heard. But that was shut down pretty fast because those lawyers were pretty darn smart, and technically they weren't doing anything wrong. And so it really relied on legislature to make a decision and come up with something to combat this issue. And it's not a judicial process because they can only enforce what's law.
Yeah.
With that being said, though, like in other states, like Maine, it's a different political atmosphere in the state's attorney's office, and they probably would have really taken us seriously. But
so you mentioned Maine. Was that because there was a similar case up there?
Yeah, actually, they have a law on the books
really
that was passed that literally protects farmers markets. Like they define it. Like there has to be a certain number, a percentage of stalls at a location to warrant it being a farmer's market. You can't have an arts and crafts fair and call it a farmer's market. Sprouts can't come in and say that they're a farmer's market. They can't do that.
They actually have that in Baltimore as well.
In the city of Baltimore itself.
In the city of Baltimore itself, they have that as well.
But it's not a county law or anything. Like it's not a Baltimore County specific law either. Like if
not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Is Maine the only state that you know of that has this law in the books?
That's the only one I know of, correct.
And I think Maine was the one that your family was doing a lot of research on because they were the only one, and you were trying to put in a legislative bill similar to what Maine had, basically what Maine had written up to begin with. So tell me a little bit about the level of support you got from that day when you were down in Annapolis, and I remember you even told me like you had a pretty interesting story about what happened at the local level too with your county council members. So can you talk a little bit about that and how the feedback you got from your county and state legislators?
I don't want to muddy up too much water. I'm not going to say any names. But during that whole ordeal, it was very difficult to separate our criticism of the name and what everybody's conception of a free country is. It's almost like we're by us complaining about it, it's making it harder for everybody to advance. And that's the impression I got from a lot of people, not just politicians, but fellow farmers too. It was a very hotly debated topic about whether you can silence somebody's name, which people get confused with this. Like when it comes to a large corporation they have no ties to the local community, they're just coming in from an external investment. And of course they get approval to be, zoned in that specific location, but they play on a completely different wavelength than us and us small businesses that have been here, born here, and have like laid their blood, sweat, and tears in this physical location. They play on a completely different wavelength. It's so much easier for them to take advantage of consumer opinion and manipulate the public. They have so many people on their side who continuously type reports and research ways to improve their sales, whether it be calling yourself a farmer's market, that is unrestricted on a federal level. And so when they jump to states like Maryland because they know that they can take advantage of us because laws are not in place to protect us small people. And so it's basically like corporate colonialism. They jump in wherever the best opportunity is, and they take advantage of the local economy. So when any of us criticize a corporation, their standards on what they need to adhere to on a legal level should be much higher than us little guys who actually have an investment in the community. So that's what I think people get really confused. And there were some really heated discussions about that. People's faces were getting pretty darn red because they thought that we were crushing the American dream by saying somebody can't call themselves a farmer's market.
Yeah, but you're not, because like you said, it's misleading, which is the whole argument I wanted to bring up today. you can't, how can they consider them, I guess, how can they take the easy road is what bothers me the most. Like you said, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears and hours. And for those who are not aware, Jones Family Farm runs their own local family farmers market. What they grow, produce, and harvest, they sell directly to you. The biggest issue with Sprouts farmers markets is not only the misleading of where their food comes from, but also the radius of how far they can go and get their food also. And I think that was the thing that bothered me the most. You know, you're looking at it was like a 500-mile radius where if they wanted to go and purchase a product, they could go and get it and sell it in their store. So it's like you said, it's misleading, at least in my opinion, where you're taking, people think you're supporting farmers directly located in Hartford County, where in fact they could be anywhere within that 500-mile radius, and no idea that they're not actually supporting your business or your farm itself, which
Exactly.
which in the long run is hurting your family's ability to go after that American dream as well. Which I think was the biggest issue.
Yeah, and the idea of a farmer's market goes beyond that. It's supposed to be cottage industry. It's supposed to be small businesses directly selling to consumers. And so even if the grocery stores were able to get local producers to sell at their grocery stores, in theory, there can still be, a large corporate farm comes in, buys 100 acres and starts selling only asparagus on those 100 acres and start, selling all of them to the grocery store. They're local, but that's not supporting cottage industry, the local economy. And that's what farmers markets should be about. It's about supporting the local economy. And if that's out of the county, it has to go to the small business. And so unfortunately, when you give large businesses the platform of a farmer's market at a grocery chain, then they're going to take advantage of it just as much as that grocery chain will.
So I have the definition by Maryland of a farmer's market is defined as a public space where fresh food from a defined local area are sold by people who have grown, gathered, raised, or caught them. That's the definition by Maryland state government.
But it doesn't say what the defined local area is, correct?
No, this is off of the, if you wanted to start a farmer's market, there's a sheet that you have to go through and there's demographics that you have to decide if you're on and all that. So I'm taking that directly from there.
So I wonder do you think Sprouts went through that process to be able to?
No, because I'm sure that they're technically under the grocery store labeling. I mean, yes, they're not labeling themselves as a grocery store, but legally they're probably under the grocery store laws.
Yeah.
And that's a different set of laws opposed to a farmer's market.
Yeah, and that gets 100% into, it goes beyond just what's written. And that, for one, I don't think that's a law, but it exists and there's clarity around it. Now it's up to the legislature, or I'm going to talk about it later, but like when we went to Annapolis to talk about Sprouts and its mislabeling and whatnot, there has to be support. There has to be common support among those who are in power to actually investigate and hold these companies accountable for their mislabeling. Things can be in place, but unless you execute on them, things are not going to get done. And that's kind of how I felt by the end.
And you said like you even had local farmers that weren't supporting you. So what was their argument, I guess, of the concept of what you were trying to argue against Sprouts Farmers Market's position?
There was something to the effect like, oh, if I wanted to start my own business, now I'm going to have a bunch of red tape on me because I won't be able, we're starting a precedence where the government can regulate how we talk and label ourselves and speak. Like we can't say whatever we want. It's more like free speech type things.
But that's not the case at all. Like you can't just take, it's almost like a trademark issue, which unfortunately it looks like we're in your situation back then, there wasn't a law in place to protect you, but it'd be like us calling this podcast like when I was doing my research on what I could call this podcast, the original title was going to be called The Open Barn. Well, that name is a trademark name out of California of an animal sanctuary farm. So I couldn't just go and pick up The Open Barn and call myself that, because I would be taking a trademark name protected by the law itself. So that part, that part confuses me a little bit, but why they would argue that in the first place? Because there's places all the time where you can't just go start a store and call yourself Walmart or Wally World or some kind of off-brand name. There's lawsuits all the time that are showing up for that. Big companies and corporations. There's companies that try to call themselves similar to Amazon, and then they got sued big time. It happens all the time. So I don't see where the argument with that would be, other than the fact, then
because no individual person owns the word farmers market.
But is it right for somebody?
No private company owns the name farmers market.
Nobody does. Correct.
Well, I think that's why they're getting away with this. I mean, who's going to own the word farmers market? I mean,
You're saying because farmers market, the word itself is a common use word or something along that line?
yeah, it's pretty broad, whereas opposed to like Walmart or Amazon, those are like individual companies own that name.
Yeah, but this also goes into like the issue of what defines agritourism or a brewery or a winery too. A little, at least in my opinion, a little bit. Because then because we have a lot of farmers in the state that argue against that too. Should a location be allowed to call itself a farm brewery if none of the product it's growing is actually coming from the farm itself? Should that be allowed? Isn't that misleading somebody? And so because they're able to do that, they're also finding tax loopholes. They're building on agriculture tax assessed land and being able to call themselves a farm brewery. And this also happened in Hartford County. I'm not sure where that case is at this point, but that's my problem. That's my problem with it, is you can throw a term onto something and use it to mislead people into thinking that it is actually something that it's not, which goes back to the whole, like, we could go into about, okay, what's considered organic versus non-organic, GMO versus non-GMO. People don't even realize that most of their foods, even though there's a non-GMO certified label on that, probably have some kind of food product in there that actually had a genetically modified GMO product in it. There's only 10 or 11 foods that are GMO products, that are grown GMO products when you look at USDA's information on the website. The problem, Adam, is not the fact that nobody owns the name. It's the fact that people are getting under the assumption that they're supporting people like Reese's farm or your family farm, when in fact they're not supporting. They're under the assumption that they are supporting a farmer's market, a real actual local farmer who works in the area and is within Hartford County. But they're able to just use that loose term and get food wherever they want within that 500-mile radius. That's my big issue with it. And I think that's what Reese's family's issue with it as well. And I'd be curious to see what case came out from Maine as to the reason why they went ahead and put in the law to begin with in the first place. But Reese, go ahead and tell us a little bit more about. Can you tell us a little bit about like what your family farm does itself, just so listeners are aware, what you all do, what you sell, people understand, the amount of work that you all put into that place?
Yeah, so the farm started by my dad. He started with 0 acres. He bought his first farm right on Route 40 down near Jones Road, Bradshaw, right past Joppatown, Southern Hartford County, in the 70s when he was I think he was 16 when he got his first mortgage, and he started selling produce on the side of the road, the wagon, and that wagon paid his way through college. He went to John Hopkins, and he paid for his way to get through there. And the point of me saying all this is that, like, we started with nothing. My dad started with nothing. My great grandfather, so my dad's dad, he sold the entire vegetable farm that we used to have on Route 40, and took it all away from his kids. He didn't want his kids to work as hard as he had to in his life. And
Yeah.
so my dad started with nothing, and he bought the property from my cousin Wayne and Joan Jones from the one on the produce stand on the corner of Edgewood and Philadelphia Road. And that's what Jones Family Farm is today. That's where we sell most of our produce now. So there's about 30 acres there, and there's about 200 or so acres up in northern Harford County in Street, Maryland, where we have another produce stand up there. We raise our own vegetables. Vegetables are our primary source of income. We direct retail through our produce markets. We go to 2 or 3 different farmers markets in Baltimore to sell down there as well. It's my sister and I. And all of the stuff we don't sell in the produce stand, we take straight to our cows that are at the street produce farm in northern Harford County, and we feed them there. And then eventually, when they're big enough, we take them to the slaughterhouse and we butcher them, and we sell the meat in the produce stand with the cows that we feed from our vegetables. We also sell Christmas trees. We have about 40 acres of Christmas trees we sell up there. That's all retail as well. In the spring, we start the season off in the greenhouse with our vegetable plants, and we grow greenhouse flowers as well to help us pick up the pace on investments on the land or later in the season. So we do a lot of different things. We offer a CSA program down there, which stands for Community Supported Agriculture. It gives you an opportunity to invest in your local farming system, and gives you continuous produce through the summertime because you invested in your farm ahead of the season. We do a lot of things in the community. I'm in the process of starting a nonprofit with my friend called Victory Gardens, which is supposed to allow volunteers and our consumers to finally get an investment in the property by actually doing the work that's associated with farming and all the great psychological impacts of us working on a farm itself. So we do a lot of things for the local community, and it's good that we have discussions like these because it talks about the powers that be that try to push us down and force us to work harder than, and I think that we have to, because farmers work a lot really hard nowadays.
So what did, and where are we sitting at today with that? What ended up happening down in Annapolis?
Yeah, so after going to the Ag Advisory Board in Harford County, we pushed it with the Farm Bureau, with our advocates there for the local Farm Bureau, Harford County. We took it to Ocean City, where Farm Bureau has an absolutely amazing bureaucracy, and we voted it up, and we finally passed it at the state level. And what that means is, Brian, you probably could describe it better than I can.
Yeah.
But when something is approved at the state level, it then is promoted by all the power and the resources of Farm Bureau and state legislature, and then it can go to federal and can be campaigned federally as well. But Farm Bureau is a great grassroots organization that helps farmers out. So once it got, I actually kind of wanted to talk about what happened in Annapolis when my whole family was invited by Jason to go to one of the hearings, which I think it directly was talking about the legislature that Farm Bureau, the law that Farm Bureau was advocating for, which was creating protections for the word of farmers markets. And so Jason Gallion was there. He was in the really big seats in front of us, along with a bunch of other state senators there too. And so I'm not really sure too much about how that government system works, but I imagine that wasn't all the state senators. And so that was like a committee, and they were going to hear our opinions on it. Right, Ryan?
Yeah. So it's like a subcommittee. I believe it's like environmental, agriculture, and I think one other. So the committees will go through hundreds of bills and decide whether or not they get approved or not before it actually gets voted on the state and House level. And then on top of it going through that committee, it has to get voted by both the state and the House for that law to get even approved. So if you don't get it, if you have a legislator, one or two legislators that don't like a bill sitting in that committee, it'll die right there, and it'll never, you won't see that bill for the rest of the legislative session. So the key to getting most bills, if you can get out of committee, you have a pretty decent shot, at least, of getting it through as an actual Maryland law. But that's the biggest problem, is sometimes who gets appointed to these committees isn't always necessarily the best person, or they may not always understand. They're probably not the full experts on that specific topic as much as they should be, which tends to, that's just where the politics in general issue. But continue with your story.
Also, probably who sponsors those bills has an effect as well.
Yeah, that plays a big part as well. But yeah.
Yeah, and Farm Bureau, when they sponsor a bill, it does have some good weight when it comes to agricultural bill, because we have quite a large. Can you hear me still?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
Sorry, I thought my speaker went out. But yeah, Farm Bureau has a lot of ties in government. I think they have a lot of positive influence on what happens in legislature. So anyway, we were there at the subcommittee meeting, and when we first got there, we go up the elevator, and the State House is so beautiful. You're just overwhelmed by its huge, grandiose effect that it has. Beautiful. And we walk in, my family, my sister, me, my dad, my mom walk in, and there's no seats. Every single seat is full. Who was there? Who was filled the room? There's people standing up along the walls too. Who was there? Sprouts
crew.
Sprouts decided to let their second shift work an extra shift, allowing the first shift to get paid to come to that subcommittee hearing and testify on how important their job is at Sprouts, and how they didn't say this, but they made it seem like they're going to go out of business if they stop calling themselves a farmer's market, and they would all lose their jobs. And they kept on testifying that all the good things that Sprouts has done for their family, even though they literally have only been working there for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months at that point. So there was a new grocery store there. But I was just very surprised by the amount. I mean, one of the officials there, they had to give my family a seat because we were in the minority. I think we got the front row of one of the sides. It was me, a couple Farm Bureau representatives, and so we got to say our stuff too. But just blew my mind. The power that's there. I couldn't let, I can't. Luckily, that was before we were open at the produce stand. If it was in July when we had to testify, my family wouldn't have been able to go. We're too busy out in the fields or in the greenhouse. So it just shows you corporations run on a completely different wavelength. They have a blank checkbook that they can use to spend in order to defend themselves. So they have to be taken at a completely different opinion than we are. Like those arguments I had with farmers, we're limiting corporations from taking advantage of us. It has nothing to do with us limiting our autonomy in the local sphere. It's about reducing their power and influence, coming in and taking advantage of us. So yeah.
So at this point, nothing changed. The bill you tried to get introduced died in committee, and now we're sitting here. Sprouts Farmers Market's still open, still working their ways, and I think they're actually. I need to double check this information, but they were looking at opening up other locations. Adam, I think somewhere in Southern Maryland as well. I need to double check.
Oh, don't tell me that.
Well, but that's the thing. So Adam and JT, I'll pass this question to you, and Reese, chime in as well. So Adam, I'll give you an example. All right. And this is, I think, why it gets me so fired up when I talk about mislabeling. Okay. So let's say in your bakery, you sell an apple pie, right? Where does your apples come from when you bake that apple pie?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Where do those apples come from?
You know, some of our products aren't from scratch, so apple pie being one of them. I honestly couldn't tell you.
So my question is, do you put a label that says it's directly from that every product that is in that pie is directly from Miller Farm?
No. So
Okay.
like our pies aren't labeled homegrown apple pies.
Right.
So we're not misleading anyone.
Right.
I guess there's no giant billboard outside our farm market that says not everything's made homemade. But as far as individual labels on products, we're not mislabeling anything that we don't do or grow. So,
And that's kind of the point. You're not openly trying to mislead people into
no, and I'm not gonna lie. Some customers do think everything's from scratch, and then if they bring it up to us, we're completely honest with them and transparent. For the pies, for instance, if they ask, was this made here? We'll say it's baked there, but we didn't make it from scratch. It's tough. We're a small business. Like Reese knows this. There's only so many employees we can afford to hire, and it comes down to logistics. For us, logistically, at this point, we can't make our pies from scratch. But like I said, we're not mislabeling them on purpose.
Yeah. And that's an example where I kind of feel like
that's just wrong, in my opinion.
Well, it's wrong if you were to do it that way. Now, it's a marketing scheme, right? And there are people that do take advantage of it. And maybe you all feel differently about that. Maybe you think, hey, it's just, we're just trying to market ourselves. We got to do what we can to survive. And maybe that's what Sprout's argument was the whole time too. There's nothing that says we can't do this. This is just we're just taking advantage of what the laws allow us to do and what the market trends are saying people are interested in, which is, as restated at earlier, the amount of research and data points that these large corporations and businesses have to be able to know what consumers are actually looking for. They're already kind of starting off on an easy route and a step up advantage. JT, what are your thoughts?
So we don't actually have a lot of products that aren't either from our farm, or if they're not from our farm, they're coming from other local producers. We don't really do pies. I do pies for Thanksgiving, but again, that's an add-on, and we tell people, look, that they're not made by us. We get a local baker to make them. And some of them, I think that they're making from scratch, but some of them they do not. They're using pre-made, jars of, we'll say, apples. I can't help where they're getting their product from, but at the same time, people, when somebody demands something, somebody wants something, it's not going to really matter.
Yeah.
I will also say this: where we're by two grocery stores, so I have a much more, I'm going to say, niche market. Like, I have the people that are shopping here and buying products from us are the people who want to buy local, buy those products and stuff like that. So we're also, in generally speaking, we're in the middle of like a lot of grocery stores coming to Maryland because of the high density of population, and people are willing to buy quote unquote local products, right? So you've got not just Sprouts, you've got Harris Teeter coming up from the south. You've got
Trader Joe's. Is that in this area yet?
There's Trader Joe's around.
Yeah.
Okay.
You
Whole
have
Foods.
Whole Foods, and was it Wegmans, right? Wegmans is another one. So all of those stores are coming in, and we're just going to have to do a better job of, I think my opinion in general, we're just going to have to stay to our niche market, right? You're never going to be able to compete the grocery store in regards to, I'm going to have everything you need. That's my thoughts on it.
here's my question to you though. Say JT, you decided that, hey, I want to turn my farm, I want to put a grocery store directly on the farm, or 5-10 miles down from the farm. But I'm gonna say that every single product from that grocery store comes from my farm, even if the product itself, and it's all local within the same area. Even if
what are we defining as local?
so within, let's just say no more than a 50-mile radius or within the state of Maryland itself. So like you could even argue that the My Maryland Best label, is that the correct term for it? So everything
Maryland's best.
Maryland's Best.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adam. So everything you have in that store is 110% Maryland's Best, or at least you claim that it's Maryland's Best. And Sprouts Farmers Market sees that. And you decide, and then not only that, you start growing and you decide that you want to put that store right next to Sprouts Farmers Markets and use a similar title and call it Albright's Farmers Markets. Do you think Sprouts would be okay with you doing that, coming in there and deciding, okay, I want to go ahead and do the same thing they're doing, but I want to take my farm to that next level? Is that what you think you should be able to do? And would Sprouts be okay with that?
Legally, yeah. Because I mean, they're already there. They're in the grocery store laws. If you move in next to them and set up a small market, then I mean, first off, you usually have to put up a sign that says, "Hey, we're looking to do this legally within the," because there's zoning restrictions. Typically, if you're going to build a new building or whatever, then if Sprouts doesn't step in and then say, "Hey, this is going to have an effect on our bottom line," then that's on them. That's not on you.
That's
Does that
all.
make sense?
Yes, that's their problem, not yours, in my opinion.
In what way? I guess I'm a little confused by what you mean by that.
So if a small business, are we talking similar sized businesses here? Or are we saying like a small business moving into and starting a store up next to another grocery store?
Starting a store next to another one.
Grocery stores do that all the time. I mean,
Right.
just look around.
But you don't think there's not even a single chance that lawyers would show up at that zoning restriction meeting and debate as to why adding a grocery store right next, like a new one right next to theirs, wouldn't be an issue in contention?
I'm sure
Because
that they will.
I see it happen all the time with businesses elsewhere.
I'm sure that they would, but you also have to remember there's a certain subsection of the demographic that X amount of people per area need X amount of access to food, right? There's actually a calculation for this, I'm assuming. And Kathy might be able to talk to this a little bit more, but there is a calculation out there that you have to, if there is, say, 50,000 people within this area, they have to have X. It is the county or city's responsibility to make sure that there are enough grocery stores or food areas in those areas for those people to be able to access food.
Correct.
So that is the minimum requirement, right? But can you go over? For example, this area minimum is 2 store. Can we have like 3, 4, 5?
Sure. Why can't you?
I'm sure it could, but
Just
the demand has to be there.
Right.
Oh, and the demand, and like, why isn't Sprouts Farmers Market showing up all over Baltimore City there? Baltimore City.
Baltimore City is a food desert because of other reasons. And that's probably a conversation we need to have with Farmer Chippy at some point. We can bring him on and talk about that. But Baltimore City has its own issues in and of itself because of crime and or lack of money or whatever you want to call it. The issues with having food deserts there. That's a different comparison than saying if we're going to compare counties to county, comparing Baltimore City to the county is not a fair. They have different issues that they're facing. Not to say that food desert is not a real thing. It is. But we're talking about a business setting up next to another business. I'm saying that legally, I have a problem with us restricting any business in general. Now, I'm not saying that if they're mislabeling, that's a different story, but saying that if we're impinging, right, on the freedoms of that company or other people, then that's no better than them doing it to
What would be a case of them doing it to us though?
you. Well, as far as like impinging upon freedoms, I agree with Reese. Like saying
But don't
products are
you
local.
don't
Like
you agree with the idea that it's essentially market fraud, right?
Oh
There
yeah,
are
I'm not disagreeing with that. That's a yes, I agree with that. That what they're selling is an idea, right? They're selling that this is local with the terms they're using, but that's also marketing. You know,
Yeah, but I think the free speech is different story.
yeah.
But there should be some law or regulation to restrict
So
misleading kind of language. For example, fish, same species, they can be farm raised or wild caught. But if your product is farm raised, but you intentionally label it as wild caught, it's illegal. So it's you are not free to do that. And
why-
also,
I read, why is it that like, I think it's over like 60% of some fish product. I think it was tuna. I think somewhere like 84%. I think it's more in the middle, Southeast Asian countries primarily, but like tuna is mislabeled a lot of whether it's wild caught versus farm raised.
yes, you
well,
get more.
probably salmon is one of them. Shrimp. Shrimp actually is the top one seafood American consume. And so shrimp, salmon, both they can be farm raised and wild caught, and oyster also. So actually seafood species substitution, it's also called misbranding. It's a little bit different story. There is law regulation to restrict, but people still intentionally mislabel their product. For example, the imported prime meat from different foreign country, but they intentionally label it as product of USA,
Yeah.
blue crab meat. So there are some prosecution, several seafood processor, for example, processor in Virginia, North Carolina, and New York. They are actually were prosecuted and they were in jail because they mislabeled their product. So that's is top one of the top food mislabeling product. We talk about honey and olive oil and some other stuffs. So do you folks hear about like agriculture product? Do they like a species substitution? Is there any case like fish?
Like
More so with like mushrooms, like you can say that the like was it is it ginseng out in Western Maryland is technically, you can again farm raise it. There's areas where you can go out in the woodlands and toss it out, and then you don't take care of it, and then you can go back and harvest it later. There's 3 tiers for that, and there's wild. And you have to have a special permit to go and harvest that. So that's probably, I mean, that's an example for us to say, you know, you can farm raise, you can do, you know, that middle ground where it's sort of farm raised but sort of not, and then you have wild. I don't know of any farm product off the top of my head that would falls in the same restrictions as that.
Yeah, none that I can think of.
So
there's a lot of agricultural products in the horticultural industry that are like marketed, like we talked about the pies, right? The apple pies, you make them from scratch or not. You know, there's a lot of, you might see in the fish industry that like people are intentionally, mislabeling the species and whatnot. But the first thing I think of,
because
substitution.
Maybe because actually there are more than 1,000 fish species in the market. Can you imagine? But for agriculture product, the species is relatively much fewer. So maybe the chance for species substitution is much lower. And also for the seafood, the different species, the price can be quite different.
Yeah.
So for example, some people have the catfish, they label it as very expensive fish, like grouper or slapper, something like that. So you pay much higher price for actually cheap product. So that's the most cases for seafood mislabeling. And another reason also for like when the imported product, they intentionally mislabel because that fish were not allowed to import it due to different reasons. So they mislabel it. For example, the imported pufferfish, but they cannot call it pufferfish because they cannot import it. Pufferfish has toxin.
Yeah, so they can't import it here
so
in the US.
But it's invasive,
they put
though.
this fish
like...
under other name, so they get into their market. So that's mislabeling also not only economic problem, also sometimes can has huge problem to cause food safety issue. For example, the puffer fish that have toxin, if they are in the market, can cause human illness. And also mislabeling, another problem is for the food allergen. If you mislabel some of the product, people who have the allergy issue may have a huge health problem. So that's why you have to follow a certain regulation for the labeling, and also for the nutrition value also. So if you label, you sell that product, it should be the real product, and the consumer get the product they expect.
But that kind of leads to what I personally believe, and maybe I'm just being, my morals are too high, but that's kind of what I think is happening with the Sprouts Farmers Market incident. I do think it has a sort of connection. But Reese, go ahead.
There's clearly a reason they're not just calling themselves Sprouts. I mean,
local fresh. That's
Sprouts, when you think of Sprouts, you would think of a Whole Foods type place. So yeah, I mean, I know there's a reason they included farmers markets with the name.
So Sprouts is originally from, I think it's Nevada.
California. I thought it was California.
Arizona. So if they're they have to be sourcing stuff somewhat locally, right? Like they're not shipping products from Arizona, right? And I'm not arguing.
But that doesn't matter though, because what a farmer's market is local businesses selling their products, which is what's defined in Baltimore City. And that's what it should be. Even if they designate products as being local within a radius, that will not stop a large multinational corporate company from coming in and buying a piece of land within that radius to then sell from like a factory farm, putting us little guys out of business, to that grocery store, because it is local technically. So I'm not a fan of anybody even. That's what happened in that subcommittee. It's not that they turned down the legislation. They made a small group Ryan, do you know what that's called when they turn into a?
Subcommittee.
Yeah, it's so they
It
usually. I think they
wasn't a
usually.
subcommittee,
To be honest,
a
I don't
working
know.
group.
A
That's
working
what it
group.
is. They turn
They
into
always
a working group.
they always
Yeah,
make working groups.
Yeah, so it was. So who was a part of it? I wrote this down. Okay, so members of it. Get this, guys. So they had representatives from Coastal Produce, Sprouts, of course. The Secretary of Agriculture. They had 3 seats on it, and then they invited my family to be on it too. And then they had somebody from Baltimore City that helped define farmers markets and whatnot. But what happened was it turned the farmers market language, it turned it from the initial purpose of which is the mislabeling issue. They turned it into, oh, let's focus on how local farmers can be integrated into selling their product in farmers markets so that they can be called farmers markets. So they were more like, between the other members, besides not Jason Gann, but the other members of that subcommittee, their primary questions were, where do you source your produce from, Sprouts? Do you try to get it locally? Okay, local, what does that mean? 500 miles. Okay, we need to approach looking at that. I don't
So-
care that you call yourself a farmer's market, but I
So,
would be
Reese-
very interested. Yeah.
I want to stop you here for a second. So do you think, and I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but in the last year, maybe 2 years now, that Maryland state legislative passed a law, and I think it's a law. Don't quote me on that one.
Do you
But
remember what it was called? I can look it
Well,
up really quick.
I don't know. But what I'm saying is that they're starting to force government agencies like University of Maryland and things like that to source products locally. And I'm saying, do you think that what you went through is partially that is causing that now? And there's different tiers, right? So you have the top tier, like, the large integrators, you have the middle tier, and you have the small guys. So like you would fit, I'm going to say, like, as a farm, you would probably fit into one of those. And now they have to source so much percentage wise from each one of those. So do you think that what you went through with this has now led to that? Because what you just said there is that, they now have a definition of what is local, right?
But we don't.
Well,
That's the
mean-
problem. We don't actually even have a definition. The only definition you could really find is if you were to put that My Maryland's Best label and slap it on there. But even that, I think we have a definition issue.
Yeah. And so I think the problem here is some dishonest people just take advantage of the situation. Some labeling is not under strict regulation, so there are so much room they can play. Even though there are some federal law about the food labeling. For example, there are Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And also there is a Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. For the food allergy labeling also. But there are the issue we discuss here, it's actually more like there is space they can get away from that, and also because of the definition is not very clear.
Yeah.
And there is no strict line, the hard line to say, hey, those products belong our farmers market and those are not considered.
So the USDA defines local as a measurable distance for food between the production and consumption that is less than 400 miles.
But if that product is out, it's not even in the
But
United States,
It's not enforceable, is it? Or not at this
right?
point?
If that is 400 miles, if you have the border to other country.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know like I don't know how the USDA or I don't know how the USDA would enforce that. I'm assuming that someone like Kathy, there's got to be someone that does the USDA like you that would enforce that, right?
Yeah, there are sometimes they use product of USA. So then that is as long as in the United States.
So then you can also say it's packed in the USA too, like you have product
Yeah,
and then you have
yes.
packed by. So like that's also slightly mislabeling, right? So you have product of USA and then you have packed in USA, but that's not saying where the product is grown.
It's not. Yeah, just because it's packaged in the USA doesn't mean it was.
Yeah, and also sometimes, especially like fish. Now we are talking about fish again.
And my phone's shutting down. Ugh, okay.
Yeah, the fish.
I'll try to get back on.
Well, we just lost Reese.
We lost
Okay.
Reese for a second.
Unfortunately. So Reese, we wanted to wrap this episode up with 2 quick questions. We have Reese on the phone right now. So Reese, a question we like to ask our guests towards the end of the podcast is, and 2 questions I specifically want to ask you. In your opinion, where do you see Maryland agriculture 10, 20, 30 years from now? And then talk a little bit about what your family farm's future plans are.
Awesome. Just so that everybody knows clearly, there was no prep to these questions. I didn't hear them until just now. So, so where I see agriculture in Maryland in the next 20, 30 years. So my hope is to see it become very decentralized. I would love to see there being more small farmers that are raising crops, farm animals on acreages less than 10. And with the development of land, the progress in Maryland we see today, that's going to continue. It's going to have to push farmers into smaller environments. And in order to make those smaller farm situations viable is to promote things like labeling of farmers markets so that these smaller farmers can sustain themselves without having to sell their products in a grocery store who nickel and dime them as it is. I don't care if they call it local or not. They will get the upper hand. The most powerful tool that small farmers have is being able to sell directly to the consumer. So I hope to see, and I think I will see, an increase in the amount of small farmers there are. And I hope to work with legislatures through the boards that I'm a member of in Harford County to make sure that happens.
Yeah.
That's one. 2, it was where my farm was going from here, right?
Yes. Yeah. The family farm's future plans.
Oh, okay. So my sister, Allison, and I, we plan on taking over the farm from my mom and dad and giving them a break. And we're seeing an expanded relationship with this nonprofit that I am starting. It's going to be called Victory Gardens, which really gets the community to start investing in their local farm with their own 2 hands. Gardening is the main thing we're going after, but we do want to expand into our educational arena as well. We love doing our field trips, and we really want to push into, again, getting the kids and even adults to become participants of the farm for the educational aspect, whether that be picking strawberries in the spring, cutting their own Christmas tree at the end of the year, and knowing how long it took for that tree to get to that point, 10 years old, how we take care of the land, what is so important about taking care of the land and the property to your psyche. So I think that's the segment that I wish to expand into, agricultural education.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to get you back on to talk about that nonprofit, the Victory Gardens, because I really like that concept, and I'm starting to see more farms in Maryland pick up that concept. I think that is kind of a very innovative way of getting people more engaged on the farms. Reminder, especially from the last episode, for those who listen, like I said, we're 3 generations removed now from family farms, and that probably is going to continue. We'll get get to a point where we'll be 4 generations as the population continues to grow. Reese, wanted to thank you for your time, telling us a little bit about your family story with Sprouts Farmers Markets. Thank you, Kathy Lou, JT, Adam, for all of you tuning in and being part of this episode. Always a pleasure. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we will be on our future episodes interviewing with Colby Ferguson with Maryland Farm Bureau, the government affairs manager at the Maryland Farm Bureau. And keep an eye out for other episodes and updates. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to all our podcast channels on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all your other listening platforms. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful week.